Jesus preached about bringing the good news of God's kingdom. During the week, during our Mutt study, we had a quote from Bill Loader about what the kingdom wasn't. And one of the things he said was, if we think the kingdom of God is like a king who is on his throne that commands all the people under him, if we think that's the way that God works, what was that, Grant? We're wrong. Barry, yes, we're wrong. Where the study was around looking at our understanding of God and how we understand that God works. And he was talking... Yeah, the good news is we're wrong. No. Well, it probably is at times, because sometimes we get so mixed up with what we think God is about, that based on what we think God would be like, sometimes it's good to know that we're wrong. Because often our perception of God, our understanding of God, is based on the things that we think God would be. Because we may think of God as a person, because that's the way we relate to people. The things about God are things that are beyond human personality and beyond our understanding. But we use that imagery to help us to relate, because that's part of our experience. But we can limit our understanding of God if we stick just with what we think about God. That's what Matthew's gospel is all about. Remember some time ago, so it was probably back in last November, I played 2 video clips about the overview of Matthew's gospel. I went back and had another look at the first one, because it came up as I was searching about what is this God's kingdom. And the video clip came up in the search. And I watched it again. And the reminder was that in the first, from chapter 4 to 7 in Matthew's gospel, it's all about Jesus announcing God's rescue mission for the whole world. That's the good news. And I thought that's a really good reminder for us of the good news, because it's easy for us to become judgmental. In the shower, I was listening to a radio program this morning that was saying about judging and about not being judgmental. And I don't know about you, but I find it very easy to judge other people, because it's very easy to see when someone else does something wrong. And our sense of injustice and concern for the world, we often think that, and sometimes the news plays into this, I suspect, our sense of injustice and that something should happen as a result of that injustice. And it's more about actually punishing, or people getting their just desserts, than actually love and compassion that Jesus had looking out on people. So God's rescue mission for the whole world. And Jesus began that rescue mission by healing people and forming a group of disciples and a community around that group of disciples. And then in the reading that we had today that Jill read to us, Jesus was healing people and setting people free, dealing with the injustice, the things that he saw in his compassion for people. And then he commissioned the disciples to go out and to do the same thing, to announce the good news and to go out and continue the work that Jesus had begun. It's a reminder that there are people with broken hearts and people that are trapped in all sorts of situations that need to be set free. Jesus' compassion was for the people that he saw and for the whole world, God's rescue mission for the whole world. But one of the things about Jesus' compassion is that Jesus had compassion, felt for the people, but then did something about it. And sometimes that's a step that we find difficult to make, because we can feel compassion for people but not know how to, or not have had much experience in how to actually help people and particularly sometimes people with broken hearts, are some of the hardest ones for us to know how to connect with. Because sometimes if we haven't dealt with our own broken heart, it can actually be too hard and too painful if we have not had the experience of our heart being healed, at least to a certain extent. But really, Jesus commissions us to not just be concerned for people, but to act on behalf of that concern. In one of the commentaries I was reading about this passage, the writer suggests that Christianity is not a philosophy that can be learned separate from those who embody it. Jesus had compassion and then commissioned the disciples. A message for his disciples, but also a message for us. And I suspect that later on, when Mark speaks to us about justice and international mission, that's one of the things that drive that unit of being able to see people with broken hearts, people that are in great need, and then help the church to actually recognise the depth of that need and how we might respond in practical ways. So we look forward to that, Mark. But also the challenge for us. How do we respond to the people around us? And who are the people that Jesus is sending us out to? The people we meet in the street, in our neighbourhood, the people in our family. Those people that we will maybe the only gospel, the good news that they hear about God might be in the life that we live and the way that we relate to them and the way we embody God's love and God's care. Good news that we share. Mark, really good to have you with us, and we look forward to what you're going to share with us.
Thank you, and good morning. It's always a little scary being thanked before you speak, but let's hope I live up to expectations. So social justice is an expression of God's love. It's about looking at what are the structural things in our society and the world around us that stop people from being able to flourish, from being able to reach the fullness of life that God had intended for all of us. So in the same way, our synod adopted, after the major strategic review, we adopted 7 mission principles. One of those was care for people with compassion, and that's largely our community service work. But at the same time, sitting alongside that was the desire that the synod would seek justice for all and to live justly itself. Now, as churches, we are an institution, and you become an institution as soon as you see yourself as having a tradition that you wish to pass on, a set of values that you wish to pass on, and you wish to live forever. So if you have that desire to live forever and pass on traditions and values, you become an institution. And I'm using that definition comes from Geoffrey Driver. He's the former Anglican Archbishop of Adelaide. He's recently had a book published, Grey Spaces, looking at the future of the church. Now we have a danger in seeing the church as being appointed by God to provide salvation if in doing so we start to feel that anything we do therefore is justified and by its nature is good for humanity. Further, it's the dangerous theology if we argue that our good deeds as a church wipe out any sins the church might be associated with. I'm going to suggest to you the church needs to be a model that points towards God. As a church, through our discipleship, we are to be the foretaste of the reign of God to come. We are not to be a stumbling block or a roadblock for people in their connection with God. But we have some challenges. How, as a church, do we remain faithful in a world where around us many business transactions often involve the harm of people or the planet? And that includes in the production of goods we might buy all sorts of terrible things, everything from murder, modern slavery, exploitation, discrimination against women in those goods. And we're exposed to these things through the things we buy, often without even knowing about the harm that's occurred in the production of goods. So as a church, we're starting to think more about those things. We're also thinking about our impact on the planet. We've just been through, last year, 2022, our National Assembly, which included people from our synod attending. They voted for a resolution that said, called on the church to consider committing to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. And in this synod, we've just conducted a consultation where we've sought people's views on that, and we will be taking a proposal to the synod. I think out of that we found it would be too difficult a commitment to make concretely, so we will continue to aim for such an outcome, but are unlikely to see ourselves being able to, at this point in time, absolutely commit to it. Not that there isn't a will for it, but there are costs when there are so many other demands on the church's time. But these things about the things we buy, the way we act, and how that fits with our faith are important to us. And I'm going to focus on particularly the issue of exploitation of people in the things we buy. And I'm going to suggest to you there are a number of theological frameworks that you can come from that would suggest that we as a church should be opposed to exploitation of people. You can see that through our belief in the need to love ourselves and to love other people as we love ourselves. You could see it through a frame of God calls us into right relationship with other people. Or one that I'm particularly interested in is, and this comes from a statement by peasants in Germany in 1525 who got together and wrote a manifesto about issues to do with their exploitation by their noble lords. And they argued that because they were created in the image of God, they had inherent value and therefore should not be subjected to exploitation. As a little side note here, I would point out that Luther sided with the overlords in this particular matter. And of course, there are biblical passages condemning the exploitation of workers through the prophets, through Paul and James. So the couple of examples I'm going to speak to you about today, one is to do with our engagement, particularly with the large supermarket chains, so with Coles and Woolworths. Now, as a synod, across our entire operations, we spend about $800,000 a year with Coles and Woolworths before you include what the members buy from Coles and Woolworths. And to take one case that's come up just recently, so Coles and Woolworths have taken steps and under pressure they try and check their supply chains and try and make sure the things they source are ethically produced. However, we do have some frustration with the degree to which they are committed to that. And an example of that is the Vasari Farms. So Vasari Farms have a farm down in Kuirup, not far from here, and they produce broccolini. And broccolini is a trademark product owned by a company called Perfection Fresh. So it's a cross between broccoli and kale, for those not familiar with it. And on this Vasari Farms, for a long period of time, there has been exploitation. We have people working on that farm who are paid as little as $14 an hour. They're sometimes given their pay in a plain envelope, not given a pay slip. They've been wrongly classified despite working there for a long time. And Vasari Farms has actually been prosecuted in court and was fined $80,000 for worker exploitation. Now recently, the United Workers Union has raised ongoing concerns about this exploitation on the farms and has engaged with Coles and Woolworths, asking them to put pressure on the farm to put an end to this. And I should point out, most of these workers are people who have come to Australia as migrants, or they're they are refugees. And Coles and Woolworths, unfortunately, have not moved to address the problem, and instead the union has now had to take Vasari Farms to court and is in mediation at the moment. So we do encourage people to take action on these type of social justice issues. In this case, we've got a letter writing action here in support of this, asking Coles and Woolworths to actually address this and to make sure Vasari Farms treats the workers working on its farm in accordance with the law as required. We've also joined the union in suggesting people not buy broccolini for the time being as a way of increasing pressure on the supermarket chains and on Vasari farms to fix this situation. The second issue I'll raise is the other area the Synod has recently taken action has been around the on-demand gig economy. So this is not kind of new for us. So this is just a manifestation of a model that we've had to deal with before. So going back in history, back to the early 2000s, the church was involved in the Fair Wear campaign, and Fair Wear focused on people working in their homes, usually migrants, sewing clothing, and they were getting paid as little as $2 to $5 an hour because the clothing contractors they were working for said, well, you're not actually our employees, you're independent contractors. And they would be asked to get an ABN, and then employment law doesn't apply to them. Once you're an independent contractor, employment law doesn't apply to you. Now, the church was part of a broad campaign that eventually successfully got these people deemed to be employees. So they were then subject to employment law. Similarly, the church joined the Clean Start campaign, which was looking at cleaners, where a similar situation was happening. People who were cleaning buildings here in the city would find that they would never meet their employer. They'd simply get hired, and they were given jobs on the end of a burner phone, and sometimes they were paid, often exploited, underpaid compared to what they should have. Sometimes they weren't paid at all, and if they tried to pursue it, the person on the end of the phone who they'd never met and whose real name they never knew would simply vanish. Now, the on-demand gig economy has taken that to a global level. So we have companies like Uber, and we have targeted Uber particularly, who have set themselves up and say, well, we're not an employer, we're just a computer platform that connects drivers and delivery riders with people who want to order food or people who need a taxi ride. And effectively they've gone around the world and they've established themselves illegally in places because taxis were a regulated industry. And by establishing themselves, they were able to undercut the livelihood of taxi drivers who pre-existed. Once they were there, as in Australia, they simply lobbied, having set themselves up illegally, they lobbied governments to get the laws changed to then make them legal after the fact. Now in Australia, Uber drivers, rideshare drivers get paid as little as $12 an hour by survey. Some do better than that. I'm not going to say the model doesn't work for everybody. I'm not going to pretend every Uber driver, every rideshare driver gets exploited, but certainly some, on average, they don't do well. In addition, we looked at a case one of the community legal centres dealt with where one of the women drivers was sexually harassed by the passengers, and when she sought to get police action against the passengers, Uber refused to give her the details of the passengers who'd been in her vehicle who sexually harassed her. Uber does this globally. In addition, they have a global structure that appears to us to be set up to avoid paying taxes. They've also undercut the system that allows for special concessions for people with disabilities to get taxi rides. There's currently a court case where there's an attempt to pursue Uber. I spoke to the lawyer involved in that case. They're pursuing 80,000 documents, and Uber's tried to put legal privilege over 12,000 of them to try and stop the other side getting access to them. Interestingly though, Uber as a model, may actually fail because they're currently making no profits despite all these activities, and they could go the way of ABC Learning or WeWork, which sort of set up, these big companies come in, grab a whole lot of market share, and then they collapse and leave everybody, shareholders, all the people who work for them, high and dry. So the Synod for the time being has asked staff not to use rideshare or food delivery unless it's directly employed by the food source. And we do have a postcard campaign. Now we use these are easy to do. You simply read the 150 words on the card, decide if you agree, and sign it. So in this case, we're calling on our government to act like other governments that have been moving to address this issue of the on-demand gig economy and try and say, well, people who work in this space deserve some level of rights. They may not need to be treated just like employees, but they need to have some employee-like rights in that situation. So that's been an area where we can act. At this coming Synod in November, we will be putting forward a proposal from the Justice area asking the Synod to have a more consistent overall policy looking at the way we interact in the business world, both in what we buy, but also in how we help try and shape the laws that govern the companies we deal with to seek a just outcome, and so that we can be that sign to the world that we are about love for all people and that we wish for a just world. Oh, and I should say I've put material in where we're having morning tea. So if you want to sign up, we have a social justice mailing that goes out. So it's a pack of materials that goes out 5 times a year. If you want to sign up and get that, please do so. Nancy, Margaret and Joan come and help us do the mailing, and they were a bit sad this morning, thinking if we get more people signed up, then the task becomes longer. But despite that, I'll encourage you to sign up to the sheets. Also, if you want to sign in the postcards, there's a post box. You can actually drop them in. We'll even put the stamp on them today for you. So I can't do better than that to make it easier. Thank you.